Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Baljeet Singh. He has been a product executive at Google, Twitter, Livongo Health, as well as YouTube, and a first tour at Google earlier in his career. And I'm thrilled to have him because his expertise spans consumer and enterprise, from product strategy to building out teams, and my personal favorite, monetization. So welcome, Baljeet.
Thanks for having me, Neeta. Glad to be here.
I am so excited. As I warned you, I have lots of questions and I'm looking forward to nerding out. So you've been warned again.
I'm excited.
So you have an incredible track record. I mean, you have built very successful product organizations in all sorts of different companies and environments. So I'll just start with a small but big question, which is, what are some of the most important lessons that you've learned from that breadth of experience?
There's a bunch to learn. I will try to keep it concise for the purposes of the audience here, but I think there's a few that come to mind. First being around stage and context matters. I think what's interesting is when you hop around from one thing to the next, you're brought in as a leader, often because they're looking at some prior experience you've had, and they're thinking to themselves, "Oh, we need that in this organization," and this person will really fill that hole and hopefully can apply some of those learnings here. Maybe that's scalability, maybe that's some domain expertise, whatever it might be. And so you're brought into these organizations to carry that out. But you really have to think about the stage and the context when you do that. Like I went from YouTube to Twitter because largely for that reason, they wanted to build out video on Twitter. There was no native video on Twitter at the time, and they wanted to have someone from YouTube come in and effectively show them how it's done, right? And I started doing that, and I was literally kind of taking things one for one, literally, how the playbook from YouTube, and you realize quickly that you can't just apply the exact same. You got to think about the stage and the context. How are you people using Twitter? How is that different from YouTube? Much more of a quick snippet of information. It's much more a chronological consumption of content. And so these types of things matter when you're thinking about how to bring video onto Twitter. So you really have to think about that. And it's an earlier stage organization. There's fewer resources. There's less you can do. And so you got to, think about prioritization very differently. And so it got to be so much to the point though, like in my early few months, I remember one of the designers put together a mock of what they thought I wanted, because I'd been asking for this one thing over and over, and they were totally trolling and pranking me because they put a YouTube logo at the top of the screenshot, and it was for Twitter. And so it was a great wake up call to me to be like, hey, I really got to think about stage and context here. That's the first one. I think the other big one is around metrics. Like, I'm a huge data nerd. Talk about nerding out. I think I do believe a lot in the data. I guess I got that from my Google days. And having a single North Star metric, I think, is hugely clarifying for all organizations. At YouTube early days, we had views as the sort of North Star metric when I first got there. And over the course of the years I was there, we pivoted that from views to watch time. And it was a great shift because it meant that people were now optimizing and have an objective function for creating higher quality sessions with our users. And if you think about it, a view, it could be totally gamified. You could put something in a thumbnail that has nothing to do with what the actual video is. People will click on and they'll drop off. And so those aren't high quality sessions in any way. And so changing that orientation and that objective function to being watch time meant that we were optimizing for quality experiences. And that meant that how we made investment decisions was organized around that, as well as our algorithms and, the sort of the engines that power YouTube were now optimizing for this new metric. So the main point is having a clear North Star metric really helps the entire organization and tough decisions, and allows for a lot of bottoms up empowerment where people can make their own decisions and silos, knowing that there's this kind of thing that everyone is marching towards. And then the last one, I think a big lesson I've learned is around having product values. I think a lot of people will talk about cultural values, corporate values. What does the organization stand for? But not as many organizations talk about what does their product stand for. What are the values and kind of the culture of the product? What stands out about the product? Um, there's a product manager I used to work with called Todd Jackson. He talks a little bit about this, and when he used to work on Gmail, and he used to say that Google at the time in 2004, 2005 was known for being simple and fast and powerful, and those were like the values of Google. And so when they launched Gmail, and every launch they had on Gmail, it would be how are we reinforcing those values and kind of doubling down on those values. And I've applied this lesson. I think it really goes this powerful way to think about, especially at a startup. How are you going to stand out? What's going to be different? There's often an incumbent. And so you need to have something that's very unique, not in like the feature set, but in, again, the attributes of it. Like what does it stand for? What are the adjectives you use to describe it? And so when I was at Envoy, it was a breath analyzer that detects if you're in a fat burning state. And so effectively our competition is the scale, like a weight scale, scale. And so a lot of times we talked about how Envoy should stand for no shame, no judgment. Like no one, unlike the scale, no one is going to be looking at the numbers and the outputs of Envoy and saying, that, oh my God, I can't believe you blew a 3.0 or whatever. That's the best thing about it, is that there's literally no judgment you can cast. Everyone can have a similar score. It's very normalizing. And so main point is thinking hard about kind of the product values, what your product stands for, and how it can be differentiated, and documenting those, codifying those, and then upon every release, checking yourself and saying, are you actually reinforcing those values? And when you make prioritization decisions, are you investing in the things that reinforce those values?
There's so much great insight in that, and in all three of those. And I'm curious, maybe the last one first. When you say product values, what I also hear is it's the other side, or maybe it's a corollary to the positioning of that product and the context. Is that fair to say? Because part of what I like about how you're characterizing it is you're talking about the competitive alternatives, not just another venture funded company or another, investor backed enterprise. So is that how you see it too? That it relates back to the positioning?
Yeah, there's definitely some correlation. I would imagine, I would hope and expect that the product values would be reiterated on the website and the positioning statements, and even the pitch text and everything. But it is something just, that may be a little less tangible. It's not a feature. So that's where it can be different. Because a lot of times talk about competitive advantages, like, oh, we have this capability and you don't have that. And that's not, I think it's different. This is sort of more of a horizontal, again, just like your corporate values, right? Or, it's like how you feel, when you go to work, right? How do you feel when you use the product? What does the user feel? What do you want them to feel? And how is that different than alternatives that are out there, right? Like, it can't be the exact same, because then you're not going to have that.
Yeah. And it's an important layer, I think, to differentiate on, because I think you're right. I'm not sure that many product leaders I can think of have necessarily thought about that. So I think that's interesting. The other thing that I think is interesting is, definitely agree with you about the importance of data, metrics, KPIs. What was interesting in your example is it sounds like you periodically were shifting metrics too, that there was a consistent North Star. So how do you think about when the metrics need to evolve?
Yeah. I mean, so early stage startups, I think it probably will evolve, but the most important thing is just to pick one, right? And like, just have everyone march toward, be pretty confident. And if you're starting to see areas where you want to make a big investment in something and it's not supporting this product, this key metric, that's a good forcing function to say, hey, do we have the right metric? Because everyone's saying we have to be investing in this thing. Or there's just like macro factors evolving, or maybe you didn't think through what optimizing for this metric turn out to be in sort of an extreme state. Again, like views at YouTube, right? It was no one, I don't think people would have thought early on that people were going to be doing this thumbnail gaming. Users were going to be thumbnail gaming and like taking advantage of it and abusing that, right? And taking it to an extreme. And so even watch time started to show its limitations when I was there, and it's definitely showing its limitations now, where not all watch time is created equal. Like you don't, there's stuff that's like purely entertainment, maybe mind numbing, like and passive, versus stuff that might be more educational, or there's stuff that's truthful and not truthful, as we were seeing in today's politics. And like, do you want to optimize for maybe what's called like nutritional watch time, right? Where that it's actually really positive and moving people's sort of lives forward in some way. So I think there's macro factors, there's internal decisions that start to might put pressure on this metric. But honestly, like I'm just surprised at how few orgs have even this. Like most of the times you go to a startup or, some relative, and they'll just say revenue is the metric they optimize for. And I just struggle with that a lot, because like you can achieve revenue so many different ways, right? And it doesn't actually help make many clarifying decisions. And ideally this metric should be somewhere mid funnel, like not, number of customers or leads or whatever, and not all the way down to the point of like retention and and sort of re-engagement, but somewhere in the middle. I think that indicates that users are getting value out of your product, and that there ideally is correlation to retention. Like if you're driving this number up, it will lead to strong retention or lead to strong revenue. I was talking to a company the other day that's looking at transcribing dictations for physicians, and we were talking about something along the lines of like, this conversation was a successful, high quality conversation that got recorded, that can be and the doctor had a good experience around that, some way to kind of quantify that, because that's going to be a leading indicator of like, that doctor's going to come back, want to record more conversations. And it's going to mean that they're going to get more revenue because more doctors are having great experiences. And it helps clarify which segments should they go after. Like that's the other big thing with this metric, is like the go-to-market metric too, of like, where am I likely to grow this number the most? Is it by going across all specializations and physicians, or is it by going really deep within oncology? And you could kind of quantify the market around this particular metric, and it helps your sales team, it helps your product team, it helps your marketing team.
Yeah, there's so much in that, and that leads in nicely, I think, to monetization, which is something I wanted to talk to you about. Yeah. One thing I think is so interesting is I think a lot of companies, whether they're startups, and I even think larger or non-investor backed companies, have the same challenge of really fine-tuning the business model and getting that right. Obviously, in a venture-funded environment, you can defer some of that decision making. And my personal sense of it from the work that I've done is that people leave that question, those important questions, till too late. And then as they're trying to right-size this business model, that's when they realize, look, our CAC is insane. We never got to lifetime value. We actually didn't know our segments. Like all these things emerge over time. But I do take your point that if you are focusing on the wrong revenue metrics, or maybe those metrics too early for the business, like that can also cause real problems. So how do you think about this broadly? Like do you have any recommendations for how whether it's a founder or whether it's, just again, a regular company, how should someone think about monetization and really testing the business model to get to something that enables you to deliver value, but more than that, so that your target customer is actually getting the value that they want and that they're willing to pay you for? Another big question. Sorry.
Yeah. No, this is good. I mean, you're absolutely right. And I know this is what I think it's an important tenet of this podcast in general. And one of the reasons I was excited to join you, because I think it's very critical that product and marketing and sales are kind of like, you're doing this together, right? And like, a lot of times I've seen founders say like, hey, we're just going to build this amazing product, and the go-to-market kind of sales muscle will get developed later. And if it's a good product, doesn't matter. Like it's a solvable problem is the sort of general assumption a lot of folks will make. And the reality is like, you can have an amazing product, but it might not be a monetizable product. And it's just a difference. Like I think there's also like something to be said about looking at the usage of the product and the willingness to pay for the product, like early on. Like, I think, people might ooh and ah over a product. But when you put them to the test and say, would you pay for it? Would you, how much would you pay for it? Does that cover your costs? Like, and then you would also like, how often are they using it or would they use it? I have an issue a lot of times when people will say like, oh, our DAUs, our DAOs are like meh, but our monthly active users are great, right? Like, and it's like, no, that's not a path to like a big business, in some way. And you gotta really, I think you can convince me that if you have weekly active users, even though your DAOs are low, it's okay. And that's true, like DoorDash, there's certain use cases where it's like, you only really need to use it once a week, and that's fine. But you really need to have regular engagement or a high willingness to pay for this to be something that you can build a business around. So to answer your question that, more directly, I think you got to be bringing these conversations in really early into your product development cycles, and often, and have good checkpoints. I think when I was at YouTube and we were building the skippable pre-roll that you now see across all of YouTube today, we call it TrueView. That whole development process was like tightly coupled with how are we going to charge for this? And it was just like hand in hand, and a lot of what we were iterating with before we launched was what is that charge point and like, how should we charge? And so we made a decision that we're going to charge on a cost per engaged view basis, which means the user has told us in some way that they want to watch this ad. And effectively, we interpret that as they made it to the end of the ad, or I think it was like 15 seconds, whichever one came first. They stuck around long enough that it was an indicator to us that they wanted to watch that ad. And so we would only charge advertisers if users made it to that point, the end of the ad or 15 seconds. And so that means, and so again, that's how we designed the product. And it was like, and we took that to salespeople, we took that to advertisers, and we tried to get to a point where everyone was kind of bought in and aligned. And then only, did we launch. And again, I think that I have examples of this, like even with Google Maps when I was working on Maps Enterprise, and we were trying to come up with a whole solution for ride sharing customers. We thought a lot about what are the features and functionality that go into this. What does a ride sharing customer need, but also like, how do they run their business? What's their P&L look like? And how would they like us to charge them? Previously, we were charging them on a cost per API call. And the reality of that was that their bill to Google was super volatile because it was all dependent on how they were integrated with us, as opposed to what you'd want, which is like their revenue goes like this, their cost to Google, like, have a correlate, or correlated it. And so we changed it. When we launched this new ride sharing solution, we changed the charging model to be on a cost per trip basis, which is so every time they have a trip, they get revenue from their customers. They give us, a little piece of that. And so again, we designed those two things hand in hand, the product and kind of the business model.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I like that it sounds like you very much were focused on aligned incentives so that everyone from the end customer to your customer, to your business model, we're all succeeding. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And that you hit it head to head on, good way of saying it, especially YouTube and then Maps Enterprise. In the YouTube model, it was the users get a less intrusive format. The advertisers only pay for engaged views. Historically, advertisers would pay for impressions, whether or not anyone cared watched it. And then our content creators were getting more revenue on a per unit basis, and so it was a win-win-win for all around. So to your point, incentives aligned. Same with Maps Enterprise, where we were totally aligned with their P&L now.
Yeah, I think that's a good lesson. I think it's a good lesson there. Questions too that comes out of that is around product market fit. And I know you have a lot of passion for this topic. This is always like a hot topic in the wider ecosystem. And one of the secrets I personally think no one tells you is that you don't just find product market fit once, throw a party and like run away to join the circus, right? Like it's a process that evolves as your product evolves, as customers evolve, maybe as the market changes, competitors get better, all the things. So can you tell us a little bit about like how do you think about product market fit, and from a product perspective, like what do you need to do if you suspect that that alignment isn't there anymore?
Yeah. And just taking a step back on this one for a minute, because I think product market fit is so different depending on industry and product type and everything. I think consumer is very, very different than enterprise in regard. Consumer in some ways, I'd argue it's actually a little bit easier because you're selling, you got basically one stakeholder, it's your consumer, and they are the buyer effectively, unless it's advertiser subsidized. But meanwhile, enterprise has some complexities because you got all these different stakeholders. The buyer might be different than their end users. And so, how are you appealing? In some cases, you have to have product market fit with both kind of stakeholder.
Right.
And then and then in health tech, because I've spent a lot of time in health tech, you often have this double product market fit where there is an entity that is buying this on behalf of another a set of users. So in the case of Livongo and Envoy, we sold to employers who provided this benefit to their employees. And so you've got to sell, to the head of HR at the company, head of benefits, and then you got to go convert all the employees. And so again, it's almost PMS. And that can be really tough on a product organization, having to think about those two and saying, which one do I optimize for? I still stand by the fact that you should chase your end users. If they're happy, they'll put enough pressure on kind of the other stakeholders in theory to make the purchasing decisions. But I think when it comes down to like product market fit and assessing whether you're on the right track, and I do think a lot of it comes back to the numbers. And looking at those curves. I mean, I think we all want to be in those teams and organizations where it's that kind of hockey stick growth. And clearly, to me, if it has that hockey stick growth, it is you've hit PMF. Like if there's nonlinear acceleration in your charts in a compressed period of time, and having a miss on product market fit or having to revisit, to me, is when you're seeing kind of much more of a flat growth or no growth. And I think a lot of times folks will try to convince themselves, oh, we're just waiting for this one thing. Once we turn on sales, once we turn on marketing, we'll see. But a lot of times what happens is, that's kind of trudging along. You add a bunch of sales efforts and now your margins eroding, and you're still not seeing that growth. And I think those are all big wake up moments. It really comes down to being the difference between a nice to have product and a must to have product. And often that difference is so tiny, like you don't even realize it. You might even spend years of your life building something that doesn't have the impact on the world. Like you owe it to yourself to be honest. And this also comes back to what I was talking about earlier of like DAOs versus WOWs versus MAOs. But just like taking a pulse on your customers on a regular basis and saying, do you love this product? Are you willing to refer it to others? How much are you willing to pay for it? And are we feeding or meeting your expectations of what we promised in the beginning? The other thing I'd say about product market fit is that like people often think of it as the top line number again, sort of customers and revenue in the door. Um, but really, you've got to look at sort of the bottom of the funnel when it comes to product market fit. Like, are you retaining those users? I worked at Twitter for a few years, and people used to say Twitter has a user growth problem. They don't have as many users as Meta and Facebook. They don't have as many users as YouTube. It's not true. Twitter had like over 1 billion users touching, interacting with this product every year. At least when I was there. And we had
yeah, we won't use the modern day numbers because we don't.
Yeah, totally. And notice I still call it Twitter. But they use they have a leaky bucket problem, right? It's like just churning through hundreds of millions of users, whether they actually like even logged in, or even if they were just like seeing an embedded tweet, like, those are users of Twitter in some way. And we weren't doing a great job of like retaining those users or converting those users to, deeper engagement sessions. And, I think it's an important thing to, figure out what is your assessment of the product market fit. And it should ideally be much further on the funnel. And an indicator that someone is like super happy with their experience with it.
That's such a smart point, especially on retention, because I think you're right. I think a lot of companies really discount that. And maybe, the last 18 months have been harder, obviously, for most businesses. So it feels like there's a renewed interest in it. But I also sometimes feel like it's just lip service, and we're not really looking at our choices all the way through the funnel to kind of see if that, are we making the right choices or not?
Yeah, 100%.
One thing too, I think that you've seen in your career, and I certainly I'm observing it too, is that in many companies, whether they're startups or maybe even their later stage, but the founder is still the CEO or just very close to the business. And my observation is there's a lot of tension oftentimes between that chief product officer and the founder vision, that idea of what the company could or should be. And so what do you think about this from both a strategic perspective and a business perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good one. Definitely seen it through various sort of touch points, whether I'm been working at a startup, whether I've been advising a startup, or even in the case of like kind of interviewing with different CPO type roles. And talking to recruiters and everything, right? And I think stage, again, really, really matters here. When, definitely early on, a founder or two founders, there's no need for a CPO or even like a really exec level kind of product lead. They will butt heads with the founders. And, I think what they really need is like likely some operational excellence a lot of time. A really glorified kind of program manager to keep the trains running, execute, ship, make sure everything's on time, and clearing obstacles, that kind of stuff. Because a lot of times they're just operating at an altitude that is not low enough that what the organization need. But so once you get into Series B, in my experience, is when you could start to think about like a head of product or a CPO type. And but even then, it can be very tricky. Like the founders need to be okay with effectively someone else raising their baby, shaping their product, right? Like I think the analogy of like kids here is really interesting. Like if you're a founder, I would ask you, like, are you comfortable, with someone babysitting your kid for a little while, for a couple hours? Would you be comfortable with like a nanny or a school or maybe a boarding school? Like, where do you draw the line, like of where you're, okay letting go? And to me, like the right balance ideally is like a founder who is comfortable sort of on a weekly basis in some way, like basically shipping their kid off to school for a week. And then on the weekends, they get to, hang out. Right. And like the idea being, let the CPO have enough agency to influence a lot of the direction on a day-to-day basis. But clearly there needs to be kind of touch points back with the founders, because you don't want to get too far awry or off course of what they had envisioned. And the founder needs to be able to articulate what their vision is and needs to be able to like codify it in some way so that, there can be some level of agency and autonomy. But, it's also a big, thing when you look for the CPO or the head of product, got to be really honest about what they're good at and, whether that's what the organization needs, but also, they need to be somewhat comfortable with change and fewer resources and those types of things. And like, I think I learned early on going from places like Google and Twitter to Livongo, you gotta be okay with some level of flux and changes in direction. But I think then the pressure becomes back on the CEO too, of like, how are we communicating? How are we collaborating? How are we bringing in the team on these changes? Because just like, obviously mandating that on a weekly basis without much context isn't going to lead to much success at all. I think there's different founders out there, right? Everyone talks about this all the time: 0 to 1, 1 to 100, and so on. And so, I think boards and VCs need to be much more honest about, making those changes too. Like, is this the founder or CEO we need right now versus the one, that we're going to need in once we get to a certain stage milestone, we hit 10 million in revenue. Like, is this the same person or do we need someone new? And I think more often than not, all those decisions are too late for a lot of good reasons. But, the other thing I'd say is like, I've never seen it be super successful when it's like a scientist founder who's had to learn all these functions along the way, sales, marketing, operations, product, while also running the business and building a leadership team. Or, when there's 2 co-founders and one of them is basically product and eng and the other one's kind of business, that if there's a product and eng co-founder and you bring in like a head of product, like you're just not as much space in the room, right? You kind of need, but meanwhile, if there's like one CEO co-founder and you're bringing in a head of product, things could work a little better. I think it's all dependent on the type of CEO co-founder, stage, and just being really honest with how willing the founder is to let go of some of this and how much they should be letting go, because maybe there's someone else who's going to be better at some parts of this, as well as the person coming in being comfortable with some change, being comfortable with, having that kind of regular check-in, and establishing kind of a shared vision together.
That makes sense. Shifting gears a little bit, I know that you have a number of frameworks that have helped you not chase low-hanging fruit. And in my humble opinion, I think this is a like holy grail problem for a lot of organizations. Could you take us through some of this? And like, I think what a lot of companies want to know, and even, just employees, I think stakeholders want to know too, like, how do we build more important things? And at the same time, like, how do we take calculated risks in a way that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this one because it's just such a common phenomena. Like, a lot of early stage companies I've talked to, advised, worked at, they would say like 100% of them have this problem of this low hanging fruit phenomena. And I get it. I totally understand how organizations end up this way. When you're investing low hanging fruit, it's implicitly that it's a known problem. The solution is pretty well understood, and the impact is also pretty well understood, and you're confident in having that impact. You're confident in having that impact. And the cost is low. So it's very attractive. Like, however, you can easily fill your entire year doing just low hanging fruit. And you look back at the end of the year and you say, what did we do? And you will not have meaningfully moved the business forward. These are types of things like fixing a login screen, changing some copy, moving a button, like, again, small, low cost, easily understood. And they get even bigger than that, but like they're they're low impact is the problem. That's the fundamental problem. And so I like to use this big rocks framework that basically where it goes, the analogy is you have a jar. Your jar is your resources in your company. And you want to put in a bunch of big rocks and some sand. And obviously, we all know that if you put the sand in first, you won't have enough space for the rocks. And so the key is you put the rocks in first, and you, whatever excess capacity, whatever excess resources you have, you can fill it up with whatever the sand, will allow the amount of sand to come in. And so, but most often the case, people put the sand in first. And they get a year, and maybe they have space for one rock, or maybe probably not. But if you're very intentional about establishing those North Star metrics we talked about early on, then it becomes easy for you then to say, what are the ideally 3 big rocks that you need as an organization to move that metric forward, right? And people can often just break it down into sort of the drivers of that North Star metric. That's an easy way to do it. Ideally, you can do it in a way that you are thinking about the investments that might even span across multiple metrics, or just the things you want to shine a light on in that 6-month, 12-month period, and say have an outsized investment in that area for the company. So if you do that, then, and the reason people will always say, well, why do you need 3? I talked to a founder that is like, well, we're thinking about having 6. And it's like, well, you need focus.
It's a lot.
A lot. I don't care how big your organization is. Like, it's just, it implies you're not focusing. B, something we said about like every employee being able to name the 3, big rocks and be able to get excited about them. You won't have that recall on 6. I guarantee that. And then the third is just like mind share and context, for the leadership team. Can people really be juggling things at a leadership level across 6 different,
Right.
investment areas of context switching, the depth you need to be effective and smart on all 6. So, better to put as that is says, put more wood behind fewer arrows, right? So, I firmly believe in, 3, maybe 4 rocks for an organization.
What's so interesting about that to me is it sounds like people are also hedging on both ends, right? Either it's all sand and it's incremental, and you're not gonna be able to fire me because it was all like good, it was good for someone, or I'm going so wide with 6 or 7 priorities, and again, like you can't be mad at me because we covered all the bases, right? So it feels like a strategic problem too of what are the trade-offs and priorities.
Totally. And by the way, one of the most common things I've seen is like the CEO founder, they've been working there so long and they have all the established relationships with the engineers. They'll be like sliding things in on the side, like all these little sand things. And so one of the things I like to do is I go and I ask to see their Jira board, right? The list of things that before even
if you're looking for the secret boards, is that why? Like the off books board?
Exactly. And then I'm like, well, is this really everything the team's working on? And normally there's like some other things somewhere else. And you look at how much capacity that's taking up. Again, you're looking at like 50% of the team. I mean, I think it's a big problem. And I think it shows up in different ways. People will start to identify symptoms of, this organization's not going well. And they point it at like one thing, but meanwhile, this is the problem, right? Like, that they haven't had these prioritization frameworks. They haven't had these kind of ways to make hard trade-off decisions.
Yeah, and it seems to me too, after hearing you, that this feels like a real prerequisite to being able to scale, which is obviously the thing that everyone wants to do, whether you're a public company or privately held. When do you think it's important to think about scale?
I think about it. Well, I actually think, and this might be heretical, I actually think it's good to not think about scale early on. And I know there's a lot of shifting views on this issue right now because there was a period of Valley startups where they just didn't think about scale and they worried about margin later, and it worked really well. But then like the more recent era, people are saying, you got to think about margin kind of early on, because maybe there's not a scalable business to be had here. The
Right.
problem with thinking about scale too early though is you start to artificially constrain yourself on tough trade-off decisions. And yeah, I do think so let me make this more tangible and specific. I was at Envoy most recently, and we had a heavy operations part of our business that was all dealing with kind of supply chain and how do we build the device, how do we build the daily disposable pod, all these things, and the shipping, and so there's a lot of cost in that part of the business. Meanwhile, we had a lot of coaches on staff, right? And there's a lot of cost in that, right? So, whether the ratio was like 1 to 50 or 1 to 500 per member, it's still a lot of cost. And I was still beating the drum that, hey, we got to like make sure we got product market fit, as we talked about earlier, right? You got to make sure you've got great retention, as we said earlier. And then we start thinking about scale. So when I thought about my big rocks there, I intentionally told the organization, I was like, we're not going to invest in coaching efficiency, and we're not going to invest in like hardware operational efficiencies when it comes to the devices and shipping. It's clear, but I also had a pretty strong conviction that you can optimize those things, like whether you brought AI into the coaching, whether you built tools for the coaches, whether you automated the shipping, automated the integration with all the different software packages when it came to the kind of manufacturing and shipping. There was clearly a lot you could do to take humans out of those parts of it, and it's sort of known and well established. So, long way of saying, I don't think that you should think about it too early. Once you do hit PMF, and you feel pretty confident about it, I think that's when you start. And then when it's important to think about how this thing can be effectively always on. I worked with Gokul Rajaram at Google, and I've always been a huge fan of his. He puts out some good content, and he talks a little bit about this. Like, AdWords is a great example of like an always on product. You set it and forget it. A lot of times, people build products, and in order for a customer to get value out of it, they have to use it. But can you set a goal that you don't want your customers to actually have to use it, or it's like so latent, ambient, use that it's just like always on. That's not achievable for everyone. I get it. But if you set that as your goal, at least, then it'll start to expose all the holes, and it'll start to expose all the places where humans are involved, that you can try to tackle each one of those kind of one by one, and automate that. And especially with this like new technology around generative AI, now is a better time than ever to kind of automate some of that work. Again, if you don't take this as an aspirational goal to be always on, then you'll never start to figure out what are the things holding you back from being a totally self-serve product.
I really like that. So what do you think makes a great product manager or a product leader?
So I have a rubric I sort of extracted from Google Twitter days that have 3 kind of well-established tenets, and then I have my own. So I'll start with the kind of the well-established tenets in the rubric, and that includes operational leadership, people leadership, and thought leadership. And so operational, we kind of talked a little bit about, it's like you want someone who can think about keeping the trains running on time, executor. This is a lot of like program management experience. And you're shipping stuff, you're reliable, detail oriented, all that. People leadership is interesting because product leads don't often have big organization, especially if they literally just have PMs and maybe design. That they're one of the smaller teams in the organization usually, but yet they have so much responsibility, in my opinion. And the way they are supposed to, be successful is through a lot of cross team collaboration and influence through that collaboration. And there's a lot of kind of consensus building that needs to happen, and galvanizing and, evangelizing the vision, and getting people on board through that. And so I think, so that the people leadership is a lot about the kind of coordination and the influence through that. The thought leadership to me is around, are they visionary? Are they creative? Do they come up with really creative solutions to hard problems? Are they studying the market? Are they on top of the trends? Are they again, like gonna come up with the approach that most others aren't gonna come up with? And so those are sort of well established. I think most of the big tech companies have a version of that in their kind of PM ladder and whatnot. The things that I like to add on are, number one, you need some level of vulnerability. I talked about how people leadership was important to be successful as a PM. And a lot of times what that means is that people have to have a lot of confidence and this kind of presence, if you will, to kind of get people excited about this thing, right? And evangelize that vision. And that requires a level of leadership and pride in some ways. But overdone, that can mean that you have blinders on. You don't know that your product is missing its mark. You don't know that you've had a big fail. And I think especially in this day and age, in order to establish trust with your organization, you have to have that vulnerability. You have to acknowledge when you made a failure. And you have to be willing to get up in front of the whole company and own it. And then move on, and then learn from it, and move on. And then a related one here is something I talk about called equanimity. I think the Asana co-founders used to talk about this a little bit. It's actually a concept that comes from like India and Hindu culture. It's in the Bhagavad Gita. Like this idea of decoupling passion from attachment, right? So again, a really good product manager will just be super passionate about what they're doing and be very excited about it, and it'll be sort of embodied in their work. But sometimes, again, that leads to some blinders that they don't realize that this product is actually a failure, and they need to have they need to be sort of so committed and passionate about it, but they also need to decouple themselves such that they don't sort of go off the cliff with this product. And so try not to take anything too personally, and you kind of want to see examples of that, because a lot of times in organizations, we see people playing this kind of blame game. Like, I'm the victim, there's the villain, there's the hero, and this kind of Hollywood drama triangle. But you want to make sure that they have some awareness about who they are, their strengths, weaknesses, their vulnerability, but also like they're able to decouple themselves and remove themselves from this environment to some degree.
Yeah, I really like that. What do you wish that CEOs, senior executives, boards knew about what it takes to build a really great product? It's a little bit of a corollary to what makes a good leader. Like what on the flip side of it could help?
I guess reiterating one of the previous points, like, a lot of times CEOs, founders, boards will say this organization is too slow in cranking stuff out. I'm doing some really formal advising right now with a group called Techquity, and a lot of times they'll present this problem to us saying, "Hey, there's not enough throughput in this engineering team." And again, it does come back to some of the stuff I said earlier around like not having the right prioritization frameworks, not having the right software development process, and they're sneaking in requests on the side. So it's like you're only getting 30% out of your team of what they should be because they're doing a bunch of stuff. It's not worth a good priority. The other thing is that, like, to establish really good product values and to establish what I would call like delight, right? Delight in your product. It's just requires a less measurable amount of investment. And I think a lot of times we want everything to be so ROI oriented, like if I make this investment, this is what I'm going to get out of it. And I think there just needs to be a little bit of trust on this side of things of like, do you want this product to be delightful? Apple, the way Apple has created so much delight among their products and the way it leads to kind of loyalty in irrational ways, that level of investment again is less measurable. But it's so critical. And so you got to have a little bit of kind of patience and trust that your team is hopefully investing in those things and give them the freedom to do that.
A little magic goes a long way, certainly. Before we get to our last question, are there any other lessons that you have picked up along the way that you wanted to share, or anything else that you'd like to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing, and like I would just encourage folks to just be, really thoughtful about their job transitions, as they make them. It's something I've gone back and evaluated. Obviously, hindsight 2020. The best decisions I made, first of all, are ones where I wasn't sort of opportunistically hopping from one thing to the next, and I was sort of intentional about taking time and creating space to be able to evaluate the next thing. But also, think about the coefficients of impact, I like to say, and which ones matter to you. I think everyone is super motivated by impact and having impact in some way, but different people care about, again, different coefficients on that. So some might care a lot about the societal impact. You might care about the number of people your product is touching. You might care a lot about the role you have in that organization. And there's different weights, right? So like, what is your weight at any given time? And I do believe those weights evolve. But just being honest, I guess, with yourself, on those coefficients, and then taking the time to evaluate your opportunity ahead of you, against those coefficients, because I think we're often just basing it on the last role we had, and we're either like over pivoting because we didn't have a great experience and like we're swinging the pendulum too far to the other side, or we had a good thing going and we kind of were looking for something similar, and you're kind of like, but you as an individual will evolve and what matters to you, and so making sure that like you're staying true to those coefficients all along.
I really love that. So just the last question for you. What do you think that high performance companies do differently from the run of the mill company?
Yeah, I mean, I think some good, some bad, right? But I do think that all leads to the high performance companies will lead to a much more buttoned up, well executed, well thought out plan through the year. The big one comes to mind is kind of risk tolerance is guiding a lot of the decisions at a high performance company. The risk tolerance ends up being low, but they have to figure out a way to balance that with still keeping growing at a meaningful clip. And so, the risk tolerance being low means that there's like a ton of checks and balances, a lot of reviews, a lot of stakeholder input, a lot of staying away from things that could get them into bad situations, legal risk, privacy risk, all that stuff. But still balancing that with investments that have really good returns and allow for growth. And so that I think there's the other big piece here is around the people, right? Like, how do you make sure you're continuing to bring in the people that are going to push the boundary and still challenge assumptions and be able to operate within kind of a low risk environment and drive the innovation. And I think a lot of times you'll see indicators of a company going from high performance to kind of medium or low performance is when you start to see the quality of those leaders kind of degrade over time. And you can sort of take stock, like, where are all those high quality leaders going? And then I think the other big piece is like this, just mapping things out with some level of foresight, meaning like you need to have a roadmap that goes beyond 2-3 months, and having it go out at least 6-9 months, ideally 12. The fidelity is going to be much lower in the sort of 9 to 12 months period, but at least mapping it out to me indicates that, like, A, you've got buy-in from all the stakeholders that matter that this is what you're going to do. B, you're taking the time, you're thoughtful enough about what are the drivers of the business and how we're going to balance all those. And then C, you can start to set expectations with your customers, and they start to be able to rely on you in ways that mean that they can bet more money on you. And then I think you're able to start doing a lot of good staffing decisions, and you're not just like responsibly reacting and trying to play catch up, every you're not 3-6 months behind where you need to be on a staffing front. And so that's a level of performance that you're going to be able to achieve because you're like way out ahead and knowing what you need, and be able to just like have people come in and be instantly sort of productive, in a way that, you just don't see in early stage companies, because they're often like looking at 1 to 2 months of best.
Baljeet, this has been so great. Thank you so much for joining us. You are always so thoughtful and insightful. So really appreciate you letting me pepper you with questions today.
Super fun. You intimidated me early on with the threat of the peppering, but I'm glad you brought it.
Well, what are old friends for, if not to keep you on it? Thank you. Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. And if you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes.